Today we will be videotaping a group discussion about the development of the Department of Children and Family Services, which was created in Los Angeles County in 1984. And to set the stage for this discussion, just a little background. In the 1960s and 70s, the issue of abused and neglected children began to emerge as a major social issue. Although not a new problem, in the 1960s and 70s, the issue began to emerge within the general population and concerns about the problem began to grow. In 1984, both of our discussants today, in fact all three, were involved in a variety of roles in the creation of the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Services, one of the earliest, if not the first, public agency to create an independent department devoted to the needs of abused and neglected children. Today we would like to capture some of the early history of that department and listen to the experiences of those people who were involved in the process in its formation. So with that, I'm turning the camera over to Helen Maxwell, Helen Kleinberg, and Carlos Sosa. To begin today, could you comment on what precipitated the concern about children in Los Angeles? What was happening that caught your attention?
Well, there was a lot of information in the newspapers. The LA Times, particularly a reporter by the name of Lois Timrick, was running numerous stories about abuse in Los Angeles. We also had the McMartin case, and so child abuse was really something that everybody was talking about. For myself, I'm a teacher, and I was working in a school with some children who were learning disabled. Some of those children had been abused. I didn't frankly know a lot about abuse other than what I had heard on the, seen basically in the newspapers. But I had been asked to be a part of something at the United Way. And so I began working on a project at the United Way that led me to working with the Children's Bureau, which was a private children's agency. And we actually looked at how to prevent child abuse in our community, which was kind of one of the really new things to think about. And we actually put together a house in North Hollywood where families or women with their children could come if they were afraid they were going to be abused. And we were using a lady from the Department of Public Social Services to refer families to us. And we were very proud of ourselves. We felt we were highly successful. And then all of a sudden, DPSS stopped sending us any families. And we became very concerned that our model, which was so perfect, wasn't being utilized. And at one point in time, I saw on the television a report that was done by an ABC reporter by the name of Ana Chavez. And she was reporting on what was going on in the Department of Public Social Services and how at that point in time we had what they called a bleeding in the street system, where the department was rejecting any cases except those where they thought the kids might die. And so there was no prevention and there was nothing else happening. And I was quite startled. And so I called ABC and I asked to speak to Ana Chavez. And Ana Chavez was very, very nice. And she told me that she had gotten most of her information, and in fact spent hours on the telephone giving me all of her information. And she had actually been talking to two social workers by the name of Bruce Cowan and Nita Whitty. And they had given her a considerable amount of information about how the department was functioning or not functioning. I then said to Anna, well, what should I do? Who should we talk to? And she said the only member of the Board of Supervisors who cares at all is Ed Edelman. And so what I would suggest to you is that you call Supervisor Edelman's office and get yourself an appointment with him. So I went and I called Supervisor Edelman's office. They were very nice. I told them, what I had been doing and all of that stuff, and they invited me to come and talk to Supervisor Edelman. What I didn't know was that when I came to talk to Supervisor Edelman, I was actually part of a large contingent of people who were addressing the Board of Supervisors. So that was my very first introduction, and that was the beginning, because those meetings that the board had and those opportunities for people to explain why there was so much going on about child abuse and all of that ultimately led to the board deciding to create a task force to look at the issue.
Well, I guess I entered it really in kind of a different way. I became really concerned and interested when I was asked by one of my professors at UCLA when I was working on my master's degree, Dr. Giovannoni, if I could assist with her research. And at that time, she had just completed a book called Children of the Storm with Andrew Billingsley. And she was looking at physical abuse, sexual abuse among different minority groups. So I got a chance to look at this research and I learned a lot. From there, when I went to work for El Nido and Council, I became district director, began to work with families like Helen in the community, became aware of a program that Roland Summit had in the Valley, but looked at South Central and there was nothing for children. Well, I too, it's interesting that I wanted to know, well, what can I do or what do I need to do? And since I'm a member of the 2nd District, I just decided that I would talk with Supervisor Hahn. Supervisor Hahn had kind of connected me with, I think, Bill Stevens, who was at DPSS, to talk about what we could do to get services for his district. And we did get an extended program. Well, by this time, we're still saying there's no services here. And we probably have one of the highest rates and most need. So as a result, he called me and said, you know, you're interested in this service and children. Why don't you be my representative on this task force that we're going to establish? And I said, you got it.
So this was really the typical way in which the Board of Supervisors acted. That when there was a problem, they had a public meeting. People came to the public meeting and then the board had to decide what they were going to do. And so the best way to do it was to then create a task force. And in this case, they created a task force, but the task force was totally loaded with heads of the department. There were 10 people who weren't part of the department, though we were appointed by members of the supervisors. But we never had a majority. And we had a very difficult time getting anything done on that task force. That task force met for more than a year. It took us about 9 months before there was anybody who even uttered a word to say that maybe the system wasn't very good. And it was Judge Boland from the Dependency Court who opened up and said, well, I'm seeing some pretty terrible things in the Dependency Court, and I think, you know, there are some serious things here. We then ultimately forced them to go out into the community and to hear what people were saying. But the Department of Public Social Services, this was all rigged. The Board of Supervisors really didn't want anything to happen from this. And they had at least 3 votes, and then they had all of their other people who were heads of departments. And this is a whole power struggle and a political struggle. No one wanted a department to lose any of their power, and so they were all there to support each other.
Well, and I think that actually it was Supervisor Edelman on it was June the 14th, 1983, that introduced the motion to establish this task force. Right. It was seconded by Supervisor Hahn. The other Supervisor Dana was not present, but the other supervisors did go along and vote for it. We had our first meeting as a task force on August the 14th. Now, the composition of the task force, as Helen had said, was to be, each one of the supervisors had their own representative. So they had their, and the 2 Helens, we really were sort of the minority voice. We were with Supervisor Hahn and Edelman, who really felt that children in this county are valuable to them and we need to do something different. They charged us with the task of basically looking at 3 options. Right. The first option was with DPS probation, and adoptions. We could look at all of the services for children that were fragmented and spread it throughout all of these different departments, very fragmented. We could look at that and strengthen each one of these fragmented pieces. That was one option. The other option was to form a new department, which was number one. And I'm not even sure, I had to talk to my supervisor. I think Supervisor Edelman, that was probably his vision. However, my supervisor, when we talked and worked more, could see it too. So we got him to dream with Edelman. Then I think that when they said, well, who should, the other people that they put on the board, it was like DPSS on the commission, they could have 2 votes. They had adoptions that they gave 1 vote. They had the DA's office, the sheriff's board. ICANN was actually one of the 5 community people. They were not part of that group. They had.
I don't think so, because Eddie was the representative.
Eddie was but they after they put the CEO and these department heads, then they decided that they would elect 5 community agencies, and that's where you had ICANN, United Way, and those entities. Eddie Tanaka was the representative for ICANN, which then gave DPSS the 3rd vote, and I believe that's what Helen had talked about how this was already in motion, because when you looked at the composition of the task force, it was basically, other than the 5 supervisors, it was basically
The county
bureaucracy that was on the board. That would be making the decision. And from the beginning, we were almost in meetings kind of led towards, well, the best thing would be to consolidate within one of these departments. However, just for children, Public Law 96-272 had just 1980 introduced. So we had a lot of things happening in our community, and SB 14, which really talked about children, how we should serve children, permanency, out-of-home care. Because prior to that, like Helen said, our children, where crimes were committed against, were not a high priority. Okay, and I think that was probably our thinking, is we need to elevate them, because if we don't take care of our children or begin to build a network and look at them being people that we need to develop, because it's for our own salvation as well. And I think that's what Helen did as a teacher, and myself as a professional social worker within MSW. Prior to that, even in DPSS, you had engineers. I mean, there was no real distinction between who was serving families or why.
Right.
Okay, and when there was cuts, there was layoff, there was no consideration of what was needed at the skill set or any of that.
There was no professionalization.
None.
And
Actually, there was a dearth of information that from DPSS, because we were not allowed. I was a division chief at the time. We were not allowed to share information with this task force. It all had to go through DPSS, centralized, and they didn't. So they picked and choose what kind of information they
That we would get.
So
So-
when we would look at it, we could be, hey, wait a minute, we have more children than this, that kind of stuff.
so the problem here was that DPSS was basically a welfare agency. And as a welfare agency, when they testified before the Board of Supervisors, they testified about welfare, because the children's piece was about 10% of the department.
And
It wasn't terribly important. And what they were successful in doing in DPSS was that they were saving money, because they thought that they were finding all these welfare mothers and all this fraud. So for the Board of Supervisors, they were a very successful department.
Yeah.
And the fact that the small little piece that had to do with children, which wasn't very well professionalized, it really and truly did not matter. Because those children didn't vote, those children didn't organize, and those children, for the most part, did not have advocates who were out there beating down the board and telling the board they had to do something. So we were presenting something that really nobody was interested in. I mean, we were out there, and the strange thing about it is that, I mean, we never questioned whether we were right or not. We knew full well that we were right. And the fact that we were going up against the county structure, I mean, we really didn't get it. We were so convinced that we knew what we were talking about, that the fact that all this stuff was allayed against us and that our chance of winning was so small, but it never really occurred to us. We were very busy. We had a committee of people who were meeting while this task force was taking place. Helen and I participated in a private little group with Nancy Daly and Stacy Winkler and Nita Whitty and Bruce Cowan. And we were getting together all of our information and figuring out all of what we had to do. And I mean, we really acted as if, you know, this was going to happen, and we were going to make it happen, and whatever they put in front of us, we would easily cut it down. That's how we did it.
Well, you had two Helens that were determined that we could have this department, and that's what the County of Los Angeles and our children really needed. We did not, I mean, we knew what we were dealing with because we knew that the bureaucracy had already, you know, we were just there.
I mean, the CAO was running the task force.
Right.
The CAO was determining the agendas.
I mean,
we were really struggling to get heard, but we were meeting afterwards. Nancy Daly and Stacy Winkler were working at McLaren. Right. They had tons of information about how kids weren't getting the services they need, how there wasn't coordination at McLaren, how much money was being spent at McLaren. I mean, we had a lot of facts on our side.
Now, one of the things that I remember happening is that there were public hearings, and your task force went around the county, and the public was allowed to provide input.
That's right.
Did that make a difference?
I think that we already knew. I think we did go around. I think they had special people presenting. They would present what they kind of wanted us to hear or to know. I think that the Nita Whittys, you had some very strong, wonderful social workers at DPSS that also shared our dream and vision. So they then would, when we would ask, well, what about this? This doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, I think you have something from the union. Why would you cut the social workers first that dealt with children and families? And like Helen said, they were concerned with their error rate. Did a wonderful job with welfare and fraud. But
when you say welfare, you're really talking about financial assistance.
Yes, of course.
And not
Because that's what DPSS is involved in.
And that was, like she said, that was their biggest piece.
So, I mean, I think that the thing to say is that we fought very hard to be able to do the public meetings. Most of the people, county bureaucracy on our task force, were not in favor. When we finally did it, one of the things that was a problem was that people tended to come in to talk about their own case. And that made people very skeptical because they talked about their own case, and everybody sort of looked at them and said, oh, you know, this is the person who's wrong and isn't doing it right and all of that kind of stuff. But we thought that we could have gotten something from those tapes because they did tape the sessions. But no matter how often we asked for them, to this day, 33, 34 years later, those tapes have never emerged.
They're in a landfill.
They're in a landfill somewhere. So it's an example of how things went against us. So in the end, we decided that this task force was ultimately going to recommend that the children's services remain with the department, with the DPSS department.
And so what happened?
And so, take it away.
Well, at that point, we were determined that the children in Los Angeles County needed to have a professionally ran department. And what we did is we got together. Helen had her group, I had my group. We organized our community. We had Helen and Stacy.
We have
and
to also
Nancy.
say that we wrote a minority.
That was
That was
Dr.
Supervisor
June Brown.
Edelman
Right.
said The only
Right.
thing we could do, if the task force was going to vote
That's
against
right.
us anyway with a majority report, and they were gonna come into the
Right.
board with a majority report, the only thing we could do was to create a minority report. So June Brown was
Dr.
with
June
us,
Brown,
brilliant.
all the way.
Wrote a wonderful, wonderful minority report.
The
and
night
we-
before.
Yeah, yeah, the night
Absolutely,
before.
the night before, we had no time to do this. I
Yeah.
think we got word and we got up, she stayed up, we were all night, got it in that Friday morning,
Right.
because when it was
'Cause
gonna
you have
be
to
hearing.
present it to the board
And they
before.
said, what is this?
Yeah.
And it was typed, and we
Yeah.
said, we want it in there.
Our report.
And they stuck it someplace in the middle, but we had a minority report.
And then there were several things that had to be done. So the problem was, first of all, the Board of Supervisors had already voted long before that there were to be no new departments. And so we had to figure out how to create a department out of what existed.
Right.
And Supervisor Edelman's office felt that our best bet was to go with the adoptions department, which actually made a lot of sense, but at the time, it was a radical idea. The adoptions department was considered to be an extremely successful department.
Very
The
professional.
adoptions department had a lady as the head, Helen Ramirez. We didn't have very many ladies. I think she was probably the only one
she
who
was.
ran a department. And so it was very controversial to do this, and the adoption department really did not want to be with us. But we didn't have any other way to do it. There was nobody else that made any sense. So within our minority report, we said that we wanted to be a part of the adoptions department and to have the adoptions department be a part of the
us.
new children's services department, which in the end and for many years later was a bone of contention because they never really wanted to be with us. They felt they were far more professional than we were and that we had lowered their standard. And so the department began with this problem that we had workers who really did not want to work together. And that's a serious thing that is a part of how this all started.
Yeah, one of the
And
things
I
that
think
worked,
that-
excuse me, one of the things that worked against us in the professionalism goal was that at that time there was a bureau that had the child welfare pieces to it.
In DPSS. Yeah.
In DPSS, yeah. And the top 3 people were MSWs. So they sold that, oh, we have master's people.
Yeah.
And we have connections with UCLA, USC, in foster, in field placements and so forth. So that kind of, but they weren't child welfare people, they were just MSWs.
Right.
And that
that's a
worked out,
difference.
that was to our detriment
Right.
of having that element, be recognized. Also, the public hearings, I attended too. The public hearings tended at times to focus on their own cases, you're
Yeah.
absolutely right,
Right.
but also foster care, which the public didn't know squat about.
Yeah.
They were focused on the protective services, the
People
emergency
came and
response.
gave their,
Right.
Yeah.
what was happening to them. But the people sitting in the group had no
Did not,
idea,
yeah.
really and truly didn't even know how the system worked.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that they didn't understand that part of the problems had to do with the fragmentation.
Yeah.
Okay,
right.
and the lack of an organized, consistent way of serving people and lack of professionalism. If you're running a bank, you don't hire a child, and if you're running a child welfare agency, you want to find the best professionals you can find so that they can begin to put those systems in place and do the kind of training that we need so that we can give families and children what they need and really somehow respect the mandate of 96, Public Law 96, 272, which is like our Bible.
So I think the thing to say to you is that the department started out with a lot of things that weren't right.
Right.
One was that the whole bureaucracy was against it, even once it was formed. Second of all, we picked
Right.
up adoptions. And third of all, we had arranged, Nancy Daly and Stacy Winkler had gone up to Sacramento and had arranged that the legislature would say that it was fine for Los Angeles to be the only county that had a children's services department that was separate from welfare. And it was a part of what happened in the hearing. It caused a lot of resentment among the Board of Supervisors that we had gone above them. And so we started out with all these things. Now, the other thing that I have to say is there was a recognition within the task force that there were things that were going on that may not have been quite right. And so maybe we ought to have an oversight commission. And so there was unanimous agreement that there should be an oversight commission. The problem with the oversight commission was that there was a whole discussion as to who you would put on the oversight commission. We were not intelligent enough to understand what we should be doing. So if I had it to do over again, we would have had an oversight commission that was made up of people from the communities, instead of having one where the Board of Supervisors would select who the people were on the commission. And so what happened in the end was that while we created this oversight commission, we made the commission so that it was so difficult for it to work. It has struggled for 33 years to do right by the children. And it is really hard because the board, if you don't have the board with you, and the board is appointing 3 people from each office, you're always fighting a battle with those folks. And you also have very little independence. We started out fighting to have an independent person who would run the commission. And we did have independent staff for a short period of time. But what happens is that in the county, you have to belong to a department. So we didn't have any budget. Our budget came from the Department of Children's Services. And so we really, our staff people were being paid by them. And ultimately, as time went on, they eliminated our ability to have an independent person. So the commission, while I commend much of what it's done, and I served as its first head, and I served on that role before, and I spent 30 years on it, I think the commission did a lot of very good work, but I think the commission is not what it ought to be, and that if there was a way to do it, I would have private people reporting to the board and have private money and private research people overseeing what's going on.
And you know, every director
Okay,
that came to the department, one of their missions, I mean, I know I was there, one of their missions was, you know, how do we control the commission? How do we neutralize some of the push? I mean, and the thing is, the push was not extraordinary. I mean, they were common sense stuff, but it was not a county bureaucracy push. So some of the things were very difficult to work with and come up with programs and things that come up because every director, I can't think of any director that, you know, the first director, Mr.
David Sanders probably is the only one who really understood what we were trying to do. But you have to remember that we only had maybe 2 out of 8 or 9 people who ran this department in the last 33 years who had any background in social work.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
and I think that when you look at the fact that we've had over our history, 14 different directors, no other department have had anything like
Is it
that.
14 already?
It's 14. And I think it's because, you know, we really have to work a little harder to really get the right person there. And just because,
I agree.
you know, you have to have the degree because that helps, but you need to have background too. You need to have the experience. You need to have a proven child, a record. Now, one of the things that I can say that I think we did do, which is a good thing, is that we now have, not only at the time, you're saying, well, how can we turn out more social workers? How can we professionalize the department? Well, we only had 2 schools, UCLA and SC, and we had to take whoever we can, and we could get, you know, with a degree, and then try to look at how to train them. We're still doing a little of that, but now we have Northridge, we have Cal State LA, and we have Cal State Long Beach. Well, what's happening, and I think too, is that we did begin to build a network in the community, okay? And they also are hiring professional social workers, okay? So I don't think we have enough demand, but we did begin to professionalize the department. We are looking at who's serving our children. We are at least, now how we monitor that, we put it in place. So You know, we just need to keep pushing on it so that we can get there. And both Helen and I are still affiliated with the department that we helped to create, because we believe, I think, don't you believe still, that we can get there one day. We want to see it
I mean,
in
we
our
don't know if
lifetime.
we're going to be old enough,
We're
but
gonna-
anyway, I mean,
Okay.
the problem is that we really wanted a department that believed that children and families came first.
Right.
And that
Right.
all
Right.
of the decisions that are made
Should
are
be
based upon what's
that.
good for children and what's good for families.
families.
We don't have that yet.
No.
We
no, I
also
agree.
wanted a department that worked with the private sector and worked with the
Right.
communities.
Right.
And we in Los Angeles are very lucky because we have some really
Good,
outstanding private agencies.
We do.
But we still have this notion that the private agencies are only in it to make money. And we can't possibly give them very much money because they're going to take away from the money that we have. And so it's better than it was,
Right.
but it's not where it needs to be. And if you don't have someone who runs this department,
Right.
who understands social services, understands what children need, you can't get all the professionals and all the
All
rest
that.
of it, because the decisions that are made are not the right decisions.
And I think that that is key. What she just said, we need to just put someplace, because until we can make decisions based on the best interest of children and their families in this county, decisions get made for a whole lot of other reasons. But we have to have people in the department who are advocates.
Yeah.
We have to really push social justice, like she said.
Yeah.
And we have to keep these things alive, because we have, and we have to depend on our agencies, our universities. You know, we need to stand up, okay, in our own community, in our own way, because it is our department, and it's going to be what we allow it to be. So Helen and I need partners.
Well, and the other piece to this, when the Department of Children and Family Services when we had this big board meeting and we had this
Oh, yeah,
big
we'll have to tell you
display
what
of,
happened.
we had the media there and we had all of these people who were recognized as television actors and actresses who came and made the presentation and got the board. We had, cameras running from every single network and all of that.
This is back in 1984.
Yeah, in
We need to
84,
say
on the
how
day that
we
we
did
won.
it.
But
How
I
did we
have
do
to
it?
say that in doing all of that, I personally celebrated and I personally thought that we'd solved the problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
That creating the department was
So that
the
everybody
answer.
else who was
Okay.
child welfare oriented.
But,
the beginning.
and it was just the beginning, there's no question about that. And what I think we've all come to understand since then is that the Department of Children and Family Services needs services from all of these other departments. And that its
Right.
major problem is that it cannot help its families and it cannot help its children unless mental health gives
Right.
you the resources you need and works with you, unless you have housing, unless you have schools,
You have
unless
health
you have
services.
health. It's, you can have a great social worker, but if a social worker can't get their
those
hands on these resources, it doesn't work. And David Sanders, I thought, was a wonderful head of this department. And he clearly left
Understood it.
because he understood that the county was not going to allow him to be able to demand services from all of those different places. And we're still in that position. So you can have a department, but if you don't have working with the private sector, and if you don't have opportunities to get the resources that you need from all of these other departments, you cannot be successful for your children and families. And that's where we're at. That's where the problem is.
And as a community, she's absolutely right. So what we need to do is we need to make sure, and all of us, we talk about building this network and this safety net for our kids. Well, now, we've helped lay the foundation and the bricks, but we are going to have to come together and really begin to build it for real. Because as long as you are allowing other political entities to make decisions based on income,
They
based
will.
on this, then we're never going to be where we need to be. And once we're there, you're going to talk about when we can figure out how to make this work together, we're going to save all kind of resources. It's not going to cost more, it's going to cost less and be better.
There was a time in the mid-1990s that the department was heavily involved in the development of family preservation programs, which were network
Right.
programs.
That's
Mhm.
exactly.
And my understanding is there was a variation depending on where you were in the county at how effective they may have been. But the model itself, in my experience, in the Antelope Valley was very, very successful.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
But it has dissolved
Esther,
as,
success doesn't matter. That's the problem. So that was money that, I don't remember exactly how we got in the
Yeah.
family
That was a
preservation.
bill, it was a
that
federal,
it
it
was
was a federal bill.
But there was
With a
5
rec-
years,
with
we
a
had
rec- run
5
record.
years
Right.
of family preservation.
That-
And
Right.
there were contracts with the private sector, and I would say that a large
Most of it
percentage of those folks did a great
And most
job.
of it worked.
And it worked.
Mhm.
But it wasn't the department doing it. It was the
Yeah.
outside
Well, wait a
private
minute,
sector doing
wait a
it.
minute. The
You
department-
participated somewhat.
Yeah. The department,
Well, you had,
What was
you
unique?
had good people, you had people within the department that had the commitment. However, there's very little that they can do without the outside advocacy to support, you know, these kind of initiatives.
no, the law allowed the state to spend the money in some way. Okay? There were a lot of models across the country. All the money went to the county, or the state
Yeah.
offices, you know, and they doled it out and they contracted and they did everything. Peter DeGree's view was that family preservation shouldn't be just DCFS,
right.
you know, responsibility. It should be the community. That's what these kids did. So that's why he designed, or at least he
Went out to the community.
went after the community and set up all these agencies, somehow who had never done,
Right.
but they had the credibility within the community, who had never done the child welfare. So that was the start of that. However, it was, you know, it was difficult because it was political.
Right.
The
Well,
politic-
once the money dried up,
Yeah.
nobody said, "Oh, behold, we saved all these
Right.
families. Let's see if we can't replicate this." You know, we just march on to something else. You know, I mean, it's
See,
Yeah,
if,
some of them, the
Yeah.
federal monies are, you know, the reason we had to go to Sacramento and to get a law passed that we could create a department was because federal law said you can contract everything except child protective services, okay? That's what federal law says, and the state, of course, mirrored that. So, the renegades, the Nancy and Anna went up there and said, look, this can't work.
right.
This
Doesn't
can't
work in
work.
Los Angeles.
So Willie Brown said, yeah, you're right. You know, we'll push it because it
You're
allowed
right.
the states to modify,
Uh-huh.
you know, somewhat. And the state would take the beating if the feds wanted to do anything. But that didn't happen. And foster care was also predominantly federal money, and the structure and responsibilities and all that fell to the state and fell to DCFS, even though foster care in LA County was run by crisis. What was the scandal this week?
Yeah.
You know, what's the scandal? There was licensing, there was all this other
And there's
stuff.
also, you have to understand that in the course of what goes on in the department, it doesn't usually get very much attention unless somebody dies.
Yeah.
And every single time there is a major child death, we go through all of this stuff of looking at why that child died. So we've just gone through Gabriel Fernandez was the last Blue Ribbon Commission. Yes, we get recommendations. The original task force had 48 recommendations. The Blue Ribbon, I don't remember how many recommendations. They get looked at, some of it gets passed. The commission, I think, has given every recommendation that's ever been asked for,
Yeah, they're not
but,
new. They're not
nobody ever pays any attention to anything the commission suggests, unless it lasts about 5 or 10 years, and then the department says, "Oh, I think we'll do this,"
Right.
you know, 10 years later. But the problem is that there's no attention to what goes on in this department unless somebody dies.
See,
And then we go through, you know, a year or two, and everybody in the department gets scared, and everybody's afraid to try anything new, and we go back into our hole.
Right.
We become very afraid of sending any children home, so family reunification doesn't really happen very much. We're getting all of our kids with relatives. Well, that seems to be, you know, our big answer here, because we have done a very bad job of creating our foster care program. We have not been supportive of foster care parents. We are being quasi-supportive of relative caregivers. But family reunification is very scary. So what happens here is that you have a professional social work group, but you don't allow them to really do social work because you're really too scared
yeah,
to do social work.
instead of, or either we set up unrealistic, I guess, data or marks that may almost be opposite and not necessarily in the best interest. Because I know, so you have to make sure you have managers and people that understand that. Because I was just telling Helen, you know, I have a manager that tells me, you're going to have to take a hit on this because I am going to keep these siblings together. And if it means going there that we're not supposed to, and you flunk your math goes, we're going to do what's right for kids. So, you know, I was telling her, I'm at the end of my career, but we got to fix that so that the young people, you know, can.
Yes.
I'd like to go back just a little bit.
Okay.
The fact that you went into that board meeting in 1984
How did we
and your minority opinion was slipped into the middle of the papers. What was the magic that happened?
Okay.
And it was more than magic. There was a lot of work that went into it. But
Yeah.
what happened that the minority report was accepted in spite of the politics?
I think that, we know, it had to do.
It wasn't a
with-
miracle. We
No,
worked.
no, we
worked really hard. Yeah, we worked really hard.
What happened, we really organized ourselves and our community. That was a meeting where I'm sure we knew we were going in there with a 2 to 3 vote. That's why we're the minority.
We had two votes.
We had 2 votes.
I mean, nobody would ever recommend going to
Okay.
a board meeting with only 2 votes.
2 votes, okay.
But we had no choice.
But when this was a board meeting where people were on the steps outside. We had people from all the communities there. We had Nancy we had a lot of our celebrities that had experiences.
Mm-hmm.
They were there, and the 3 board members, when they saw all of this commitment, all of this involvement, they were almost forced to vote for it because
It was political suicide.
Well, it was an election year, first of all, and Dean Dana was
Right.
so that was a part of it. And the presentation before the board was a
Right.
professional presentation. We had professional help. Henry Winkler was probably the number one celebrity on Channel 7. He knew the number one celebrity on Channel 4, and he knew
Right.
the number one celebrity on Channel 2, and he knew Lyle Alzado, who was a
Right.
football player and well known. And what happened was that Nancy and Stacy got us professional help to figure out how to present each of our celebrities, and what we did was a celebrity and then an expert, and then a celebrity and then an expert.
Because Dr. Brown
And all of the
testified.
networks were informed that their number one celebrity was appearing before the board. So, you never saw so many cameras running in that boardroom ever again. And they photographed each of their people, and everybody knew that on the news that night, on their particular channel, they were going to run their person, who was their number one person, telling everybody that they needed to have a children's services department. And then, because Dean Dana was up for election, and Dean Dana was opposed to this department, but Alexander Pope was the person running against him, and Alexander Pope happened to be a foster parent. And Alexander Pope started explaining to Dean Dana how important it was to have this children's services department. And we laughed because we all remember that Kenny Hahn was sitting next to Dean Dana, and he leaned over to Dean Dana and he said to him, He's got you. And that said to us, we were gonna get Dean Dunn his vote. And that's how we got Dean Dayton his vote. He was afraid of an election, and they were all afraid
Right.
of what was gonna go on in the news that night.
And
And so this really and truly had nothing to do with doing the right thing for children.
okay.
And so all
But
of this,
it said something about your skill in presenting
Yes,
your case.
it did. I mean, we had professional help. We weren't so smart. We had professional help. But what it also says is that we forced the board to do something that they did not want to do. And in the end, that caused this department to have a very, very, hard birth.
beginning.
Their
The birth
beginning
was
and it is a tribute to the department, to the people who work in the department, and to the commission, that this department lasted this long.
And-
Because the first 10 years were
Right.
very shaky. And the first person that was hired, Lola Hobbs, as she
she lasted
reminded me.
5 months.
Yes, so I thought it was
4
4
months.
months.
4 months. 4 months.
Four
Okay.
months, okay. She didn't know what she was doing. She was a trained social worker, but she came to Los Angeles. She had a whole board that was against her. She had every department that was against her, and she could not find her way. The CAO had somebody tagging her everywhere that she went. She lasted 4 months, and then they brought in Bob Chaffee, who had worked for the Department of Public Social Services. So this was not anything the department wanted. I mean, the board wanted. It went against everything, and there was very great resentment against everyone who had participated, and the fact that they didn't get their way. They spent, more than a year on a task force. They did every single thing they could possibly do to undermine this, and we still won.
How did this translate to the implementation, Carlos? Because that's where you...
Well, you should ask.
Yes. Okay.
Well, first of all, there was a lot of confusion among the line staff and
Okay.
as to what was going to happen, who we're going to move, we're going to have this, we're going to have that. A lot of misinformation too. Except
Right.
we were hoping that the hope was that we would become really independent. And housing of social workers was one of the big problems because we had always been housed with eligibility staff.
DPSS.
And in closets.
So we always had crappy space.
And who found it for us?
Hmm?
Who put them in crappy space? It was Bob Chaffee who we got because
Well, he was
he kind
Bob
of-
Chaffee was a good choice because he was a good old boy.
And that's
Right,
right.
He was a good old boy,
And he got us
and
out
he
of
knew
the
how to
closets.
system. One time he
Right.
complained to us
Right.
about,
Yeah.
I was at exposition and the space was terrible, how did we do this? And we told him, well, you did it.
Right, and that's
You're
what
the
he
one
told
who was
us one
opposing
day. He
us.
said,
And
"What?"
so,
He said, yeah.
what happened here was that the department
that is
had
sad.
nobody at a high level to protect it. And so
That's true.
Eddie Tanaka and DPSS took all of the good offices,
Right.
many of the good people, all of the good, I remember discussions about the telephones and, we didn't have computers in those days, but they took everything.
So
The
Bob had to
department
give
was
it back.
left with almost nothing.
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 Absolutely.
I mean,
nothing.
they moved in very quickly to pick up everything that was good, and there was nobody to protect them, I mean, the only one who had created this was Supervisor Edelman. He certainly wasn't on the line out there protecting them. The CAO was against them. Every department was against them. And so we started with this really difficult time. And then I remember that we brought in some consultants to help us to look at the staff and to see what we could do about the staff, because we had all these angry adoption folks, and we had all of these people who had been working at DPSS and hadn't really ever had the full scope of what their work was supposed to be.
Yeah.
And so we sat down, and this consultant went around, and we sat in a
Said
big
Adhesis.
circle. Adhesis, you got it, Adhesis.
Adhesis.
And the question that we were asked was, who are you serving? Who is it that this department is about? And for me, I was very shocked, because a lot of them felt that they were servicing the Board of Supervisors. A lot of them felt.
I remember that was said,
Remember,
yeah.
this was true. I went home, I was just about
Right.
blowing my mind. It was terrible. We had all these people, the top people in this department. They thought they were servicing the Board of Supervisors or the court.
Right.
Nobody thought they were servicing any
The
children or families.
Yeah.
And so here you are, you've created this thing, but you've got all these folks, they have not the faintest idea who they're supposed to be servicing. I mean, it was really appalling. He had a fishbowl, and everybody was asked to put on a little piece of paper what they thought they could fix in the department, and there was not one intelligent idea in the whole group. I mean, I think we had about 300 little pieces of paper, but these folks, they had no vision, they had no idea where they were going, they didn't know what they were going to do, and now they wound up with Bob Chaffee in charge. And so, you know, this is where we were, and the problem was that the department very much suffered from the fact that nobody wanted it. And that it was going to start at ground zero. You were the abused child in this whole group. And
Well, that was the said, was that we represented that we were the personification of the abused child.
But I think that what we have to do and look at, it's true, is how do we, as a society and a community, how do we deal with our children and families? Because whoever is our department head has to be courageous, strong enough, secure enough not to be, and I think we had David Saunders who left, who said, I'm going to do what I know that we need to do. We have the answers. We have the best and most brilliant minds of any place. California is one of the most creative. We are the only department. And I think that we can do it, but we have to say, we got to get the politics out, and we have to go back to, what are we here for? You know.
So let me give you an example of the kinds of things that are really still a problem. One of our problems is that we have a lot of families who need mental health services. We have a lot of children who need mental health services. We don't even understand how to work with these children and make sure that we deal with their mental health their mental health issues. We don't know how to give them to a relative or to a foster parent or something, because we don't know what these children need and how we should be treating these children. So within the department, we have an extraordinary need for understanding mental health services, for understanding the children that we're serving. We also have needs because we have a lot of people who are involved in drugs. We have a huge need to be able to work with people in the health department. We need, housing. We're dealing with kids who are being emancipated and are staying with us until they're 21. We do not have the expertise to handle all of this. One of the things that we on the commission spent a huge amount of time on was the Mental Health Services Act, because the Mental Health Services Act had money in it for children like our kids.
A lot of money.
And the Mental Health Services Act also had money for prevention and for all kinds of things. I personally sat on a committee looking at how we could utilize the Mental Health Services Act, how we could bring it into the department. Well, we got some services from the Mental Health Act. We didn't get nearly what we should have gotten.
No.
Because in the end, the Mental Health Department spent a lot of the money that should have gone for kids. And we went to the Board of Supervisors, and we fought like crazy to show them. We actually, Trish Curry we went line by line as to how they were spending all of their money, and we could show them that mental health had overspent their money for adults, and that they were therefore taking money out of the children's pot. There was nobody to back us up. We could not get the board to believe us that this was happening. Even though we presented all of the paperwork, we did hours and hours of work on this. Nobody was willing to do this. So herein lies the problem, that unless you have members of the Board of Supervisors who are advocates for children and stick their neck out to make sure that every single one of their departments is saving the money for the kids, and unless you figure out a way where you can bring people from those departments to work with your social workers in your department. And we have tried a couple of these.
Right.
We've had nurses, we've had mental health folks sitting in our offices.
Right.
We still don't do it well. We have to figure out a way
It
to
has
do
to be
this.
seamless.
Because the Department of Children and Family Services, I think, or maybe probation too, is about one of the only departments that absolutely has to have services from everybody. And if you cannot get those services from everybody, you cannot do the job you need to do. And how you structure that, I'm not even sure. But it has got to happen. And we've talked about nurses going out on calls with social workers. We've done some of this has been successful.
Right.
But the other piece to it is that because nobody's really advocating for this stuff, you don't have people who are really evaluating these programs. And so there's no money for evaluation, and there's nobody who stands up and jumps up and down and says, we've got it, we're doing this, we've got it, this one is really working. Let's duplicate it.
But
There's never any money to duplicate it.
But even when it works and it's successful, what we really have to do, even when you say it, we have to get the politics out.
Yeah.
Okay? And
Well,
we are
that's the
going
hard
to
part.
have to go back to children and put someone who knows child welfare, I'm just gonna say, in charge, so that when the nurses say, oh, I can't go out, or mental health says, I can't bill for that, you say, no, you're part of this team here, you will go out and you will do that, okay? That's what you have to have. And you have to tell the other departments that, yes, you have these mandates, but you need to figure out how to work around them so that we can do the service that we need to do.
Yeah,
And
the sad part about-
that's what we have to
about
put in
what
place.
Helen and Helen are saying is that we're the only, I still identify with
Yes.
DCFS is the only department that cannot turn down a client. You realize that? Probation can refer to us, mental health can refer,
we
health
can't.
service can refer. Everybody can refer when they reject the client because, they're not appropriate or we don't have a way of meeting their needs, except us, except DCFS. We have no way of saying, heck no. Why? Because there's a child involved in that, this. And that, well, you can't get the politicians to look at that, and that's why child welfare, and not just here in LA, but child welfare is so politicized that it's so hard to get anything done.
Well, and you have to look at it because you almost wonder why. Well, we know our budget is 2.2 billion,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I'm almost wondering, sometimes how we can begin to utilize what we really have, because we have enough. It seems to me if we would do
Well,
it,
but,
because
when I
you're
was-
looking at how many, and you break down where the staff is.
When
and
I
you
did
look
some
at that,
research at
it tells you
USC
a
when I
lot.
was on the faculty about
Tells you a
the
lot.
money, because the answer was always, well, we don't have the money. Wait a minute. It was never a shortage of
billion.
money. It was never a shortage of
Billion.
money. It was a shortage of will to move the money
Yeah.
around.
Yeah.
That's really what it came down to.
That's it.
How do we say, just like in normal, you and I, where you have your bank account and you spend it according to where you think your needs are. But you can't do that with child welfare, and it makes it very, very difficult to move money. But we keep asking, what did they tell us? Oh, we were the queen for a day.
The CEO
Department,
controls.
well, we got to beg for more money. And in some way, they were right when they asked, all right, what have you done with the last $5 million we gave you? Well, we had no, because nobody was evaluating whether that was,
What I tend to hear in this discussion is that the department has fallen prey to that very phenomenon that you see across the board in behalf of children, and that is that advocacy and work with
Right.
children is devalued
Right.
because of the helplessness of children and the families. Unless there is a champion, someone
Right.
who
Yeah,
can take
that's
the
right.
leadership role,
right.
they never get what they need necessarily, nor do they get a fair hearing in
Right.
the broader scope of things.
Yeah.
And this is true in medicine and mental health, in all the
Yeah.
areas.
Yeah.
And so your vision for this department was that it would champion children.
Yes.
Mhm.
That it would make a difference in how we
Right.
perceive those needs and respond to them. What do you think? Is there still hope for us?
Well,
Well, we went 33 years
wait,
hoping.
we're 30,
We're
and
about to hire a new department head.
Well, Helen and
Yeah, you
I
are.
are here, still here, and
That's not
still
the hope,
here.
I hope.
And I, in our time, I'm hoping that, yes, we will begin to see something, but we are going to have to build externally and internally the advocates that you're talking about. We have to have, because bureaucracies tend to hire people that will go along.
Yeah.
Support,
Okay.
that support them
Not
around.
people
Yeah.
that will speak up for what is right. Okay.
That's
So what we have to do is to begin to build that kind of advocacy and support internally and externally, even the agencies.
I don't think it can be done
You
by the
don't think
department
so?
itself.
No,
I-
I'm not
I-
saying the department, I'm saying
I said national,
saying
philosophically. Yeah.
Community,
I
community.
think
We.
this really requires the educators
Oh, right.
and the social work
I think so.
institutions to take a look at this
I
and
do
to
too.
begin to look at how could you create, maybe it's neighborhoods, maybe it's counties,
You're
I don't know
right.
what it is, where you could combine the dollars and where rather than having all these siloed groups,
Right.
you could have social workers and mental health people and health people and all of that committed to children all working together. And I think your educators, your educational
Right.
schools
You're
also have to
right.
look at this too, because the county will never come up with this. The county is very happy in its silos. It's got its departments.
Right.
Each department has its money. It has, what they'll spend for and what they won't spend for, and it doesn't change so much every year. And the people that they hire, when I started to meet social workers, many of whom I really adore and think they do a fantastic job. But the one thing that always struck me is that I could sit down at a meeting and this person could turn to me and say, I only have a year and 10 days.
See.
And this one will say,
Say,
I'm
I'm
only going to be
leaving here.
around, for another
And when
3
are you
years,
going?
and
Yeah.
I just can't wait to leave. And I thought to
That's
myself,
good.
this is a really sad thing.
It
I
is.
had never been anywhere where a whole group of people,
Are
the
waiting
first
for
thing they're
you.
all talking about is what they're going to do when they retire. Because
Right.
the job itself is so hard,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't really get a lot of credit for what you might be
Or
doing.
the support.
Or the support. And so I think a lot of these folks start with very good intentions.
You're right.
But I'm going to tell you, after I've been there 10 years, I'm looking at my retirement, and
Right.
I'm looking at not rocking the boat, and I'm
Right.
looking at making sure that if I'm going to change anything, I'm going to change it just that much, because I'm not going to be criticized or look like I'm one of those crazy renegades out there who's nuts.
Okay.
And we are looked at as if
Right.
we are nuts.
Yeah.
But
I'm sure
the
that
county structure, the legislature, they are never going to come up with how this should work.
And I think.
And I don't know where else to go except
I
to say,
think-
I think the schools need to start looking
I
at how
think
you
you're
do this.
absolutely right, because we have the consortium, because when Peter DeGree came, I was working with Barbara and I said, why don't we sit down with all of the deans in the school, okay? And I think that we have schools now, we have the deans. This is the only, our children's service department, institution that really is unique, and it's ours. It's a social work. When I say ours, it's akin to what we do in our training, and I think Helen's right. Where are the schools? Where is their voice? Where is the social justice? And how do the schools and those deans, like the Council of Social Work Education, how do you get around this? How do you begin to organize with us in the community? And I'm just saying,
Yeah.
to make a difference.
But also to be aware that our schools also are bureaucracies.
Yes, no, I know.
Yeah.
We
Oh,
know.
yeah.
And,
But it's
um,
different.
Yes, you're gonna worry about where your
Right.
money comes from and who you're aggravating and, you know,
And
everybody's
we
a bureaucracy, yeah.
We send our social work students into the bureaucracy to
Right.
learn how to deal with the bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy, that's right.
So it's going to take some change, not in perception and in planning and in
Right.
looking at it in a whole different way. So
And
I
it may
You're
be that
right.
there's money put together and we look at, you know, the private agencies that have been successful joining
Right,
with
with
the
this,
people
with the
who,
universities.
you know, I don't know, but I
Yeah.
just know
We
we
need
can't
something.
get anywhere. I mean, we're looking for a new head of this department. I don't even know if we're gonna hire somebody who knows anything about social work. But whoever comes, the job is too big for them. They need much more help on the outside. That I cannot imagine that somebody's gonna come here and be so successful.
But
And
I-
that's really sad for
and-
me. And as much as I try to think about how in the world do you change this? How do you fix all of this?
Well,
I don't know.
but I think we are gonna have to go back
To what?
to when? Go back in the day and say, okay, what has happened where we can't organize ourselves in this society around children and families? I mean, we gotta really answer that question. What is that barrier? Okay, because we need to move it out of the way, because we're not getting, our children and our community is not getting better. Okay, we're supposed to be the keepers of the norms, the values. We need to figure out how to do it, you know, or go home, the degree. Okay,
Well, we have a lot of kids who aren't successful in our education
Yeah.
system too.
Right.
And the educators aren't really looking
Looking
at what
at
those
that.
problems are either.
Well, we have come to the end of our time for today,
Oh.
but are there any closing comments that you'd like to make before we call it a day?
make one, Helen.
Make one, Helen.
Yeah,
No,
okay.
you know, I just think that, as Helen said, children are terribly important. Our society
Yeah.
really needs them to be successful. We spend an enormous amount of money on children.
Right.
Given what the department spends, what the other departments spend, and what the education community spends, and yet we never get together and say, how could we make this better? How could we better allocate
Right.
all of our resources? And how can we develop a commitment to doing what would be right for the children and the families and for our society?
Uh-huh.
It's just a waste.
I think
And
that's
put the
that's
right people
philosophical.
on the
Yeah.
commission and boards. Maybe we need a few crazies.
Yes, support the crazies.
Right.
I think that's what Helen was saying with regards to every time we review children's services, it's in the deficit.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
we should start
Right.
Oh,
renewing
good.
Looking at
Renewing
children's
the
services on the
positive.
positive.
What works.
Right, what works.
Where should we be?
Right.
What have we
Where
done
do we
right?
wanna
We haven't
go?
done a lot of things right, but we've done some things
Oh,
right.
yeah, we
you know?
have. We have,
But it
but
always has-
whenever we're successful, we bury our success and we go on to something else.
It's always
Yeah.
the deficit.
But we gotta
the
stop
deficit,
that,
yeah.
and we need, and we
And
need,
that's part of
we
the
need more
institutional
commissioners
Thinking,
like
I
you.
asked one of my colleagues at USC, how come we always, Ron Astor, who's a guru for school social work, I asked him, Ron, how come all the research that we always do is on what's wrong?
Yeah.
Right.
You know,
That's
That's
right.
true.
how about some research just do what's
That's
right?
Where are your successful
Oh, so that
cases?
we
Ten
can
Who
percent
made
of
it?
all the
Yeah.
adolescents
So we
become
can do
delinquents.
more of that,
Yeah.
so we can
And I'm
do
saying,
more
well,
of
what
it.
about the 90%? Why
Yeah.
come
And
90%
build
didn't
on what's
become
good.
delinquent?
That's an excellent point. We do need to do that, because then we can build on that instead of the deficit model.
Yeah.
And we're supposed to be strength-based. We're strength-based. So let's be it.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very interesting discussion today and interesting information about the formation of the Department of Children's Services, later DCFS.